Hello and welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. Thanks, guys, so much for watching. All right, we warn a lot on this show about the rise of the technocracy, CBDCs, 15-minute cities, social credit scores, vaccine passports, and all of the other ways our lives are going to be surveilled and ultimately controlled. But what can we realistically do about it? Well, today we're going to be talking to Derek Broze, investigative journalist, documentary filmmaker, and author of How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State. So we're going to dig into what exactly we can do to shield ourselves from the oncoming onslaught of control tactics. Derek is also the co-founder of the Freedom Cell Network, a decentralized movement focused on building local mutual aid groups for independent communities. Derek has researched, written, and narrated more than a dozen mini documentaries and full-length films, including Bringing Down Jeffrey Epstein, The 5G Trojan Horse, The Great Reset, The PCR Deception, and the 17-part series, The Pyramid of Power, which explores who is really in control over the various industries that are impacting our lives. Derek is also the lead investigator for The Last American Vagabond, which we just had Ryan Christian on last week. And we're going to have actually Whitney Webb on later this week. She's also with The Last American Vagabond. He has most recently been covering the Fluoride lawsuit, which we actually discussed recently on this show. So we're gonna ask him how that's going. Derek Broze, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me on, Kim, and thank you for all your work.
Thank you. All right, first I have to ask you about the Fluoride lawsuit because that has been the thing you've been covering for, how long has this been going? 2 weeks now?
I was in San Francisco for 2 weeks, but the lawsuit's been about 7 or 8 years now.
Right. Yeah. We had Michael Connett on, and I never knew all of the things about fluoride, all of the problems with fluoride until he educated myself, and I'm sure a lot of people who watched that episode. So you've been covering and then he told us that they were going, that was right. I think he came on the show the day before they actually went into court, and then they did the court. So the court hearing was 2 weeks long, roughly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Just wrapped up, and I was there in San Francisco from day one till the very end, and I was live tweeting 5 hours in the court and writing some articles for The Last American Vagabond. I know you just had Ryan on. So I've been following it closely. And then even before, back in 2020, when the first phase of the trial began, it was only on Zoom. Then I was live tweeting and following it then. So It's an important story that I'm glad, we're talking about it today, because I think I'm sure Michael told you there's been no coverage of it in the mainstream at all. And that hasn't changed in the last 2 weeks. There hasn't been a single peep from them. And surprisingly, not a whole lot of main alternative media talking about it as well. So happy to get the word out, because there were some pretty powerful revelations that came out in the last 2 weeks. I did have a chance to interview the Fluoride Action Network, who Michael Condit is representing. I got a chance to interview 3 of their expert witnesses, Dr. Bruce Lamphere, Dr. Philippe Grandjean, and Dr. Howard Hu. And I mean, some of the things they shared, these are the kind of things that you would expect in a different world. These would be on, the front page of the New York Times or something, making it clear how dangerous fluoride is to pregnant mothers and how it is a neurotoxin. And so I'm happy to share some of that information today.
Yeah. So the court case lasted so both sides got to present their cases. What did the other side have to say for themselves? I mean, Michael came on and he gave a really good, gave us a really good understanding of what the problems were with fluoride. And I just thought, what in the world could the other side say? I mean, why even just keep continuing to do this? Like, just stop putting it in the water.
Yeah.
It seems simple enough.
So the EPA, the EPA was basically the government attorneys that representing the EPA were basically their job the entire 9 days of total court time seemed to be to try to paint as much doubt in the judge's mind. Judge Edward Chin, he's a great judge in terms of he seems to be fairly neutral. Like, he doesn't seem like he's on the government side. He's also not just giving it easy to Fluoride Action Network. He's really trying to keep up with it. And one other thing, just kind of side note here, the reason this trial is so unique is because it's the first time, at least in recent memory, where a federal judge is being asked to judge science. And scientists typically don't want their work second guessed by lawyers or courts, things like that. So the judge, obviously not a scientist, is having to keep up and learn this information as it's happening in real time. And so he was asking a lot of questions and trying to understand, what is a margin of exposure and point of departure and benchmark dose analysis and all this jargon that you really need to understand to get the science behind it. And so the EPA's job seemed to be to just confuse him and to make him have as much doubt and as much uncertainty as possible, because essentially what Michael Conant and his side are having to argue and are trying to prove is that under the Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA, that fluoride is a neurotoxin and thus it should be banned. But if the EPA can succeed at confusing the judge or making him doubt the evidence, then they're trying to say, look, it's just not strong enough. You shouldn't make a ruling because, we now recognize that levels of 2 milligrams per liter in fluoridated water, there is some sort of harm. We can't quite distinguish when it begins. They would rather it be murky and cloudy than anything definitive, right? And so they're trying to tell the judge, yes, we recognize there's problems at higher levels, but down here at 0.7 milligrams per liter, which is what the CDC recommends, it's less certain and less clear, and so you really can't make a conclusion.
I just don't even know why they're fighting this. Are they being sued for a lot of money and that's why they feel like they need to fight it? Or is this just a cease and desist putting fluoride in our water?
This is just, there's no money involved at the moment. This is just the lawsuit was a result of the EPA rejecting the petition, which citizens can file petitions under TSCA. And so this is also historic because it's the first time a petition made it all the way to a federal court. But in terms of money and kind of financial interest, one of the reasons I think that there's such a pushback here is you have to consider that we're coming up on 80 years now of water fluoridation in the United States. As the trial was going on, the UK announced that they're interested in developing a program potentially fluoridating that country. Canada is studying it right now. So it's still a policy that is being promoted. For example, the CDC has it on their top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century, along with vaccines. It's still very much held in this high regard. And so you'd have to imagine the CDC, the FDA, the ADA, American Dental Association, and any other branch of government or organization who has spent the last 80 years promoting this could potentially be open to class action lawsuits as parents start to ask, did my child lose a few IQ points? Is my thyroid messed up because of my exposure to water fluoridation? Is my liver and kidney, are they suffering? Because there's so many other issues associated with fluoride. The trial specifically focused on the neurotoxic elements, which is obviously important, especially we're talking about prenatal and postnatal. So while the babies are just forming, it's crucial. But there's so many other impacts of fluoride that really it doesn't make any sense. But that's essentially what they're trying to do, is to try to downplay the evidence, because I believe they are worried there could be class action lawsuits if the judge finds in favor of the Fluoride Action Network.
Well, there would be if it turns out that they knew this information and they just ignored it. I mean, it's one thing if they really didn't know and the science has just come out, right? But it's another thing if they're fully aware of this and they just said, yeah, it's all right, we're still doing it because cavities. I mean, that's the other thing that's just so ridiculous about it. It's all
to that point. To that point, during the last 2 weeks, it has come out. I mean, there's definitely, the evidence is available. We know, for example, Dr. Philip Grandjean from Denmark, respected scientist, it's his work on mercury that actually the EPA used to develop the mercury toxicity standards. You also had Dr. Bruce Lanphier done work on lead. These guys are testifying in court about the information that they've known. And Dr. Philip Grandjean actually told the story of another Danish researcher named Kai Roham, who was a scientist back in the 1930s, who went to Greenland to study the cryolite mine workers there. They were mining this cryolite mineral, and a part of that, they were exposed to fluoride. And so he started studying it back in the 1930s. He published a book in 1937. He was the first person to discover skeletal fluorosis, and just discussing all the different health problems that these men were dealing with. So here we are nearly 100 years later and still trying to convince people that this isn't some conspiracy theory, that you're not a wacko. Because as I'm sure you know, Kim, talking about this in mainstream society would not get you the respect you would like as a journalist. And for me, as somebody who's following this and keeps up with it, it's kind of mind-blowing that I'm in the federal courtroom following this and most people have no idea it's even happening. If I was to walk outside the courtroom and ask people what they thought about fluoride, they'd probably call me a conspiracy theorist for questioning it, right? So there really is this evidence that we have now through this lawsuit and through more of the data that's come out that not only has the science been there and the data has been there, but if I could just for a second, I'd like to point out something that Dr. Grandjean told me, because he worked at the WHO and he worked at Harvard, and he told me some pretty powerful statements just this last week about how essentially he was ran out of Harvard because they didn't like that his data was starting to show that fluoride is a neurotoxin. He also said he was invited to participate. I'll just read from him. I don't want to misquote him, but if I can, again, this is Dr. Philippe Branche. He says, this is about Harvard first. He says, a professor from Harvard University came to my office and asked me to sign a statement that my work on fluoride had nothing to do with fluoridation. He actually wrote this draft, and since I didn't sign this immediately, he instead went to my dean and he had the dean sign a statement that he supported water fluoridation in accordance with the policy of CDC. And he said after that, that leadership at Harvard told him that his research was unwanted. And he said, quote, because we couldn't agree on what I would consider my academic freedom, I left Harvard. And then in terms of the World Health Organization, he was invited to speak or to participate in helping them develop what they call an environmental, I think it was an environmental assessment of fluoride, and help them develop environmental health criteria. And he said as he started to gather the data and put it together, he noticed that changes were being made to his draft report. He said, quote, they inserted changes in my draft indicating that fluoride could perhaps be toxic, but only at immense concentrations. I protested and said that in accordance with the scientific documentation, it would be wrong to insert the word immense. And so the WHO published a document without my name because I'd asked to have my name stricken. And then they inserted some other colleague's name as the author of the draft, which is, of course, erroneous. But that was what the WHO felt was necessary in order to protect the interests of water fluoridation.
Yeah, and it's just, wow. And it's so bizarre because when I was talking to Michael Conant about it, I mean, what is their, why do they want to keep doing this just for cavities? I mean, this is not like, hey, we're saving lives by vaccinating you against COVID for saving grandma, although that would be the next step. And that's what worries me. It almost makes me feel like that's why they're fighting this. They're fighting this because they want the ability. It's not about fluoridation of the water itself. It's about the ability to medicate us in mass in this way.
Absolutely.
As they feel like it.
That is definitely, I think, a crucial argument to pick apart because over the years, I've been involved with fighting fluoride back in Houston. I started an activist group called Fluoride Free Houston. We were going to visit council members and talking to people. And I realized that the scientific data, especially if you're not a scientist, most people are most skeptical of. They're like, I don't know, man. How do you know this? The dentist says it's okay. All these scientists say it's okay. But then you could talk to people about the argument you're making, that it's the only thing added to the water that is for medication. And shouldn't you have the right to medicate yourself how you choose? Shouldn't you have the right to use fluoride toothpaste if you want, or to add it to your water if you like? Why don't, and in the case of water fluoridation, of course, your tax dollars, especially in the United States, are literally going to pay to add this toxic substance to the water instead of the mining companies where a lot of this comes from, aluminum phosphate mining. Instead of them having to dispose of it on their own, they're getting your city or your town to pay to add it to the water. So, you could argue about it's a financial waste, it's a health harm, it is a violation of your bodily autonomy. I think any argument you use is fine, and it fails on all of them.
It really does. I mean, it really, really does. Was there a jury or was it just the judge? Who decides in the end?
This is a bench trial, so it's just the judge. So as we wrap today, now the judge will sit with the evidence, and we're expecting weeks, probably could be months. We're not really sure. I do know the judge, based on his previous statements, he seems to be getting the gravity of the situation now. That essentially every moment that the fluoride is still in the water and people aren't told that it's a neurotoxin, pregnant mothers are consuming it. And instead of getting a warning about, hey, you should avoid this while you're pregnant and really altogether, but, just to kind of put a cap on that, the data that was presented during the last week or two, Dr. Howard Hu was talking about how as a mother progresses along her pregnancy, by the third trimester, she's getting just high amounts of fluoride as it increases throughout her pregnancy. And why is that? Well, mothers tend to drink more water, consume more as they're progressing. Their baby's growing, so they need to get more nutrients in there. And of course, the baby, everything that the baby has just comes from the mother. So in that third trimester, as the baby starts to form its own skeletal structure, it's going to be pulling typically calcium from the mother's bones, but fluoride stores in your bones and it displaces the iodine and your thyroid. It stores in your body. And so as the baby's pulling what it needs, the nutrients and everything else to make its own body, and calcium from the bones of its mother, it's going to receive that fluoride directly into the placenta through the blood-brain barrier. And so, I've been focused on this for years, but honestly, the last 2 weeks being in the courtroom and hearing this data, it just kind of reinvigorated in me how important it is to get this information to as many potential mothers or current mothers, because you're drinking it in the fluoride water, that's one thing, but if you're eating processed food, it's more than likely fluoridated. If you go out to eat more, unless it's specifically reverse osmosis, it's probably fluoridated. The shower, it's in pesticides as well. There's a lot of different exposures, so the water is just one source of it, and you really need to kind of grapple with that and recognize that if you are pregnant or considering having a baby, the data is showing that it will negatively impact your child's cognitive development if they are being exposed to this while you're pregnant.
I guess the people that want to continue doing this just want to raise a nation of dummies, right? They want us dumber.
It sure seems that way, right?
So that we don't push back, we don't challenge them, and we just follow along. Okay, whatever you want. Wow, that is just so. Why a bench trial? Why not a jury? It just seems like a lot of power for one person to hold in their hands, whether or not to ban fluoride from being put in our water.
I'm not sure if that was a decision made by Michael Conant and the Fluoride Action Network, or if that's just how it works in the terms of the EPA's TSCA petitions, because this is a sort of, again, it's like an unprecedented situation. I think there was even some confusion on how does this move forward? What's the next step? How do you proceed with this? And we ended up with Judge Edward Chen, who, as I mentioned earlier, I do think in terms of court systems, and obviously they're not perfect and they can be corrupted, and I'm fully on board with that. But if for the current system we have, if you're going to have judges, you would want somebody that seems to be very neutral and not easily swayed. And that's what I've witnessed over the last few years, is he does seem to be genuinely trying to get to the bottom. And I would honestly say, I've had a lot of people ask my assessment. I would say it definitely looks good. It's hard these days to kind of have any optimism because of just how bad things can be. So I'm skeptically optimistic, but I do think the judge was listening, and there were definitely multiple times. If I could share just one more brief moment, actually, to kind of emphasize this, one of the government's witnesses is Dr. Stanley Barone, who is a senior science policy advisor with the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention at the EPA. He was involved in doing risk assessments for the EPA, specifically under TSCA. So definitely would be considered an expert, so much to the point that he was actually a witness for the plaintiffs, the Fluoride Action Network, and for the government. But there was this really key moment on the last day of actual testimony from the witnesses, where Michael Conant, who is, I think, a brilliant attorney, was just doing a great job drilling into Dr. Barone, because, again, the government's witness's job is to be as difficult as possible, not really answer directly, yes, but caveats, and, okay, I'll offer a long-winded answer, and maybe the judge is confused by the end. And he was doing that, but Michael Conant was really just keying in on talking about pregnant mothers and the kidneys and oversaturation, and how those who have difficulty already processing things through their kidney, fluoride is going to build up in them. It's going to affect them even more. And a lot of the arguments have been, look, even if we know we can't pinpoint the exact place that fluoride causes harm, using what's called the uncertainty factor, we should be considering the most vulnerable populations, which is what the EPA has done every time before. And it should probably just be banned regardless. That's how they've acted with mercury and with lead. But so Michael Conant is asking Dr. Barone about this. And he says, specifically, he says, you testified earlier today that there may be oversaturation going on in the kidney at the 95th percentile level in the fluoridated areas. Do you feel comfortable as a risk assessor exposing pregnant women to a level of fluoride that is so high that the kidney is oversaturated? And at this point, Dr. Barone just froze on the stand. I mean, everybody in the courtroom kind of noticed, everything got super quiet. And I think at least 5 to 7 seconds passed before he even said anything, which was a pretty strong moment. The judge noticed it. The judge was sitting there watching the whole thing. The EPA tried to at one point kind of intervene in the line of questioning, but the judge, overruled them and allowed it to go on. And in the end, Dr. Barone basically offered this winding, no, but this and that. And at the end, he said, my opinion isn't germane to the discussion. So he's there on the stand as an EPA risk assessor expert. And when asked this question, he has no answer. And then he says, my opinion doesn't matter. It was a really powerful moment. And unfortunately, none of as far as we know, the court video might not make it to the public. But if it does, I will be sure to clip that moment out and share it around.
It really seems like, in the minimum, the judge would say, you have to start putting warning labels on water, I guess. Like, people need to be told, at the minimum, if they're not going to ban it, at least let people know, especially, as Michael mentioned when he was on the show, pregnancy, infants, it definitely, they're targeted, but also the people with kidney problems. And the thing is that those who are suffering from kidney failure need to drink extra water. I mean, they need even more water than the average person. They have to stay really hydrated. From what I remember, I think that's right.
And they will consume more fluoride as of unless they're not drinking fluoridated water. Exactly. Right. And that's pretty much what this question was about, is like, do you not care about the people who are already suffering and the fact that this is going to build up in their bodies and their kidneys will become oversaturated with it?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like you should have a choice. If you want to drink fluoridated water, maybe, I don't know, maybe Brita could come out with a special filter where it's added. And then you can add that into the water if you want to have that extra benefit of no cavities or fewer cavities or whatever, right? I mean, it's just such a
I agree. You know, and
such a bizarre.
one
Go
other
ahead.
argument about that, Kim, I'll just add, because I think this is, again, another topic that gets labeled as right wing conspiracy theory. But I've spent a lot of my time in my activism working with activists from across the spectrum, and I've spent some effort trying to get folks who are more left leaning progressive to see that this is an issue that should matter. And I just want to throw that out there, that what you were just saying, look, if you're somebody who cares about the poor, cares about lower economic, socioeconomic status, that is who's going to be impacted by this the most. Because who can afford to buy filters for their showers and for their houses? Usually people who've got a little bit of extra money to spare, right? Or who've got the time or the money to buy five-gallon BPA-free jugs and go to the local filter station and fill it up. Maybe you don't have a car and that's not convenient. Maybe you don't have the time, the money, et cetera. So if the people who are going to be impacted by this the most will always be the poor folks. So if you consider yourself an activist who cares about those things, that's something to think about. And the other thing is, I think that fluoride, the fight against water fluoridation, could be framed for those who need this kind of framing or who enjoy it. As an example of environmental racism, if you will, because again, it's going to impact those in the lower economic status who tend to be poor people. Not obviously, some people are white and poor, but typically black and brown neighborhoods. So if that's the way, that's the argument you want to take, the argument is there. So whether you're left, right, whatever, I think there's so many arguments to trying to convince people on the local level and then hopefully here on the federal level to get it out of the water as soon as possible.
Yeah. And just if you want, brush your teeth with fluoride toothpaste, mouthwash with fluoride mouthwash. It's like such a basic, if you want that benefit, you can have that benefit in many other ways. We don't need to force everybody to drink it. My biggest concern in hearing about this lawsuit is just the lack of medical autonomy. It really just having the ability for them to force a medication on us for the only reason it's there is for medication. It's not purifying the water. It's not doing anything like that. That to me is just really, really, really frightening. So great work on that. I do want to get to a bunch of other stuff because you've done some really great work on many, many other topics that I want to get to. We're going to take just a little break here and go to our sponsor, and then we're going to come back and we are going to talk about how to opt out of the technocratic state, how we can protect ourselves from the oncoming onslaught of surveillance and control that just seems to be looming more, closer every single day. We'll be right back with Derek Brose, investigative journalist, author, documentary filmmaker, activist. We'll be right back. Let me guess, your medicine cabinet is crammed with stuff that doesn't work. You still aren't sleeping, you still hurt, and you're stressed out. That's how it was for me. So I cleared out my cabinet and reset my health with CBD from cbdistillery.com, and it has been a real change. CB Distillery's targeted formulations are made from the highest quality, clean ingredients, no fluff, no fillers, just pure, effective CBD solutions designed to help support your health. In 2 non-clinical surveys, 81% of customers experienced more calm, 80% said CBD helped with pain after physical activity, and an impressive 90% said they slept better with CBD. So if you struggle with your health with a health concern and you haven't found relief, make the change like I did to CB Distillery. And with over 2 million customers and a solid 100% money back guarantee, CB Distillery is the source to trust. And I have a 20% discount to get you started. Visit cbdistillery.com and use code Kim for 20% off. That's cbdistillery.com, code Kim, cbdistillery.com. All right, Derek, a lot of us are really worried about the oncoming, just sort of the technocratic state, the technocracy, the surveillance, the CBDCs, the 15-minute cities. You wrote a book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State. I talk a lot about it in the warning sense, but what the hell can we do is a whole different part of the topic. First of all, paint the picture for us right now. Like, you've been researching this for a long time. How, I don't know how to phrase this in a way, like on a scale of 1 to 10, where are we? Like if 10 is the end and they have full control and they've now, gotten to us, or on a scale of like 1 to 100%, like where do you think we are today versus where we were 5 years ago or even 10 years ago? Does that make sense? Are we getting better?
Yeah.
Are we getting worse? Are they getting more control?
I think they are definitely advancing their agendas. I'll say that, as far as let's say like what they are doing, all these different forces and people who would prefer the Klaus Schwabs of the world and
Right.
those folks. I would say as far as their agenda advancing, we're probably at a 6 or 7 if 10 is, complete, control everything. Not to say that everything has gone their way, of course, but I mean, look around. A lot of the agendas are becoming pretty mainstream after COVID. Vaccine passports quickly morphed into a discussion on digital IDs. We're seeing the explosion of digital identity programs in parts of Africa. Of course, discussion of central bank digital currencies and other forms of government controlled programmable money. These are all agendas that have been promoted by Klaus Schwab since at least his Fourth Industrial Revolution book, and even longer for some other players. So I would say, their agenda is advancing, but I also like to think that the people's agenda is also advancing. That is what my book focuses on: how to opt out of the technocratic state. I want to let everybody know they can download it for free at theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. You can purchase it and listen to the audiobook, of course, everywhere else. But if you want to just check it out, PDF version. I wrote this book at the end of 2019 and published it January 30th, 2020, right before COVID happened.
And right before it got really bad, and then they really wanted to come after us with all the technocracy, right?
I mean, a lot of the stuff I was writing about, it happened 6 months after I published the book. So it was kind of like, okay, but I didn't, predict COVID or that it was going to come in the form of a pandemic. But I knew that these agendas were progressing. And the reason I was writing the book is because a lot of my journalism, especially back in Houston, has centered around digital rights and privacy and surveillance. Because in 2013, I was leaked some images from a Houston Police Department officer who was showing me that I was under surveillance for some of my activism. And that essentially just kind of began a journey diving down the rabbit hole, trying to understand what is surveillance technology, what tools are that: Stingray cell phone surveillance technology, heat detection technology, gait detection, facial recognition, all these different things. And so I've been following these technologies and writing articles about it for years, and writing about warnings from people who are much more knowledgeable than me, lawyers and digital rights attorneys, warning as far back as 2017, saying facial recognition is advancing pretty quickly. We should probably think about what's coming next. The fact that, for example, Illinois is the only U.S. state that has any sort of facial recognition protection for your face print, as it's known, which allowed companies like Clearview and others to step in this space, of course the government as well, and develop these massive databases of all of our face prints as we've been taking selfies for a decade plus now and giving them info. And so I was writing the book kind of partly as a warning of, guys, if you haven't noticed, there's some scary things kind of on the horizon, and also as a guide, or sort of offering some ideas and tips that I personally use in my life. I haven't had a bank account since 2008.
Wow.
I try to stay out of certain systems. I don't use a phone. My partner, she uses a privacy phone. My buddy has a company who does de-Googled privacy phones. So I try very much to stay out of their systems and other ways that I will keep off the record for now as much as possible, because not only because I think that it's what aligns with my principles, because I don't want to feed the war machine. I don't want to feed and support these companies, but I think that's also going to become necessary as they're building this increasingly entrenched, interconnected, digital dystopic world where without a digital ID, without a government wallet that has all of your money and knows everything you're doing, then you won't be able to operate in these mainstream systems. And so I was kind of just asking the question and encouraging our movement, if you will, or people who are thinking about these things, like, well, what comes next? We understand that there's all these bad things coming on. We hear about Agenda 2030, the Great Reset, stuff like that. But what are we doing on our side to make sure that we can continue to stay free and thrive? How do you maintain liberty and privacy in a world that is increasingly throwing those things out the window? And that's kind of what the book was trying to ask, as well as provide some answers and some solutions to. And so I published that in 2020, and then I republished it late 2022 with the second edition, which has 5 new post-COVID chapters based on everything that we learned during COVID, because, lockdowns, travel restrictions. When I came to Mexico early in COVID, part of it was building this network of people who are trying to get out of Germany, Australia, Canada, and some of the really bad places, coming to Mexico, because Mexico ended up being one of only 2 nations that had no shots, no quarantines, no things like that. And so we started to see, I think it was Nicaragua for a little while. I don't know if they ended up holding out, but Mexico stayed all the way that way. And that doesn't mean every part of the country was, completely free. Different. It was kind of decentralized like the US. Some states were a little more forceful about it. Others were not. But on a whole, there was no quarantine for foreigners. There was no lockdown, no shutdown. And so a lot of those lessons learned went into the second edition of the book, because as I say in the book, that I do believe we will see climate lockdowns or another pandemic, or I think essentially that these people, what I call the predator class, have shown their hands. I think that they've shown us the tools that they're willing to use: coercion, firing you, the travel restrictions, all these sort of things that we saw, and that we would be wise to not just kind of sit back and continue on and forget about it until the next time it happens, but perhaps think about the way we're living our lives and the way we interact with digital technology, especially the explosion of AI and video, audio fakery, and how are we going to interact with that? And where's that red line for us? Like, are you willing to submit to facial recognition so you can continue to fly? Are you willing to accept the digital ID because you got to keep working your job? And I think COVID was just a preview of that. And we saw some people were willing to move across the country or move states or move across the world if it meant staying free with their family. And I witnessed this. I met many people who literally had sold everything they owned and got out of Germany or Australia because they were locked down in true tyranny, and came to Mexico just with a hope that maybe something would work out for their family. So I tried to take that knowledge and really turn it into this book here.
Well, I'm glad you updated the book, because before COVID, certainly things were very different, and after COVID, I think that a lot of people open up their eyes. Um, and I think that you're right in saying that they've advanced themselves, but so have people, right? Because we have become much more aware about this. And so we have caught on to a lot of their antics, like the debanking and the censorship on social media. And we do have people that are fighting back on it. What do you think the chances? I mean, what you're doing is, I think, extreme. And I don't think most of us can like debank ourselves or not use phones or not, all the things that you're doing. I think most of us need to have, connection, right, to to these things. And so the one thing that I could think of, like just even here, Rumble, just trying to build alternatives and say, we're not going to put up with this. And so we're going to build an alternative. And then you just have to hope that the alternative stays strong and doesn't get sucked in or bought out or.
Absolutely. I mean, so that is the message of the book. In the book, I talk about, so it's broken down in different parts. The first part is a little bit of history for those who don't know what technocracy and the sort of history of that movement and what it meant, which is essentially what we saw during COVID. Trust the experts, the people at the top, the technicians, the experts, the scientists. They're going to run things and they're going to micromanage our lives, and they promise it'll be a utopia. And I essentially argue in the book that even though this philosophy, we're told, sort of fell into the dustbin of history, that I think it's actually been the guiding force, and it is the guiding force for people like Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab and others, that they believe that they are above and beyond governments or the people's desires and business, et cetera, and they want to set the agenda. They claim in the name of a better humanity. And so I provide some of that history, and then I discuss what I believe is the answer, which is the philosophy known as agorism or counter economics, which is essentially what you were just talking about. I kind of coined my own term. I call it exit and build. And this is like the idea of exiting from slavery systems. This could be if you do choose to unbank yourself, debank yourself, and then maybe you go from being at, for example, JP Morgan Chase to a local credit union. That's a step in the right direction. And in the book, I kind of provide these steps of, here's maybe your big picture. I'd like to have land and growing my own food and not be dependent on the grocery store, but maybe that's not where you're at right now. So, visiting the farmer's market every weekend and supporting local farmers is a step in that right direction, right? So it's all about taking those concrete steps. You don't have to throw away your phone tomorrow, but you could choose to stop using Google as a search engine right now. You could choose to go to privacytools.io or nomooregoogle.com and look up alternatives to everything that you're doing right now that Google does. There's already alternative companies that exist. And just like with Rumble, a lot of these alternatives you're not going to hear about unless you go search them out. And they need our support. They're not going to be able to sustain themselves and last if they don't have a customer base. And so that's really kind of the message is, where can we see the systems that they're trying to build and recognize, okay, staying in that system is not conducive to liberty, to privacy in the long term for me or my family. I need to rethink that. So if I want to avoid the CBDCs, how can I start moving some of my money into, a local credit union or whatever alternatives, a lot of people into silver and gold and precious metals, stuff like that. I'm not here to give financial advice, but the idea being that you are seeing what's coming. Instead of just sitting there like a deer in headlights, you actually start taking some concrete steps to build something new. And we're not all going to be the ones building the infrastructure. You didn't build Rumble, I didn't build Rumble, but other people come along and they embrace it. They support alternatives and things like that. And so that's kind of the idea, is how can we exit from these slavery systems that we clearly see are being erected in front of us and, for us, around us, how do we start to exit from those systems and build and or support those who are building new ones? And that's really what a lot of my work focuses on. How do we build parallel systems? That's like the work that I promote in the book and through the Freedom Cell Network and some of my other projects is very much about trying to get people using the journalism to educate people, get them to realize there's some scary things going on, but at the same time trying to have a deeper philosophical discussion about how we're going to connect and interface with this technology. And we're all going to have different red lines, of course, like maybe some things you'll be willing to put up with that I won't, and vice versa. And it's just up to us to have that conversation, because if we don't even think about it, we are going to sleepwalk right into their world, because they're moving their agendas forward. We should probably be putting some thought and energy into thinking about what is our 2030 going to look like. And for me, I want privacy, I want bodily autonomy, I want to be around other free people, I want clean food, clean water, and I've got some land, I'm homesteading and stuff like that. But whatever your ideal is, you should probably start thinking about putting energy into that, because that is not what they have in mind for you.
It is very frightening. The most frightening thing, I think, is the being debanked and by these platforms. I mean, when they decide that they don't like what you have to say, they decide that you're protesting the wrong thing, right? The trucker convoy in Canada.
Yeah.
They debank people. And that, when Ryan was on this show, he talked about being, PayPal stealing his money and seizing those transactions. And that's, Mercola's been debanked. I mean, the debanking, I think, is the scariest thing. And I think that's what people have to face and contend with, is that, these people, the technocracy is growing so much power. They're gaining so much power that, if we cross over the line and we try to fight back, they can just say, okay, well, without money, you can't do anything. I mean, you can't eat, you can't go anywhere, you can't gas in your car.
And they've created a system that in many ways, we're all kind of born into it, right? And so we only know what we're taught and shown by our parents and our, what society sees and what we accept as normal. So we get to a point now where we realize, oh my God, they're holding all the cards. They can lock me out if they want. And especially if you're somebody who is deeply ingrained into the system, maybe you've got $30,000 in student loan debt or some credit card debt, or you got a mortgage. You have things they can hang over your head and, try. And we saw with COVID, they will try that coercion in addition to bribes and other things, depending on whatever their particular goal is. And that's why, again, I wrote the book because I do think travel restrictions, I do think debanking, lockdowns, these various tools can and will be used. And, in terms of what happened to Ryan, I think it's happened to everybody on the TLAV team. I know that Whitney had issues with Patreon for things she hadn't even posted on Patreon. I got deleted off YouTube in October 2020 when my YouTube channel was growing at the time because of talking about COVID stuff and things that didn't align with the World Health Organization policy. Thankfully, it didn't affect me directly financially, but obviously I write for TLAV. So if they take our money, then I'm not getting paid. And I've seen the real world impact of this. And I don't think we've seen the last of it. I think it's a tool that now we're going to see continue to be used in different ways.
Well, that's why we have to come up with a plan. I mean, I want to hear what you think the plan is. I would think one of the first things people should do to start off is get like a year's supply of food. I mean, just start off with the basic. You've got to eat, right? So if they cut you off from the bank, you still at least have food to eat. You're not starving. You can hold your ground, especially if it's something you really care about, because you have a year's supply of food for your family.
Food is vital.
So I've always been a big proponent of gaining that storage of the food system. I grew up in Idaho, though. In Idaho, the mentality of Idahoans is naturally suspicious of the government.
Texas too.
Yeah, we're a natural libertarian, rogue, kind of rebellious people that just are suspicious of big government. And so a year's supply of
I grew up with my grandmother sending us canned goods from her farm in Kentucky. So again, similar idea. Like it's not unusual for me to grandma sent a box full of whatever she was growing that harvest, and I've gone there to the farm and helped her. We've been conditioned through, I think, shows like Doomsday Preppers to think that preparing, which is all prepping means, preparation, thinking of the future, is some kind of horrible right-wing crazy thing, when all of our ancestors, no matter where you came from on the planet, had to prepare for the winter to make it through, to survive. And so, like what you're saying, Kim, is incredibly important, storing water, storing food. And I don't think you have to even come from a place of fear, like you're in a panic, the government's about to storm your door down. It's just about being smart. Again, prepping doesn't have to necessarily be the zombie apocalypse or the next COVID. It can be a weather emergency. It can be, the power goes out. It's just smart. And this is what all of our ancestors knew. And we've just been conditioned because things have gotten so comfortable for most of us that we don't even think about it. But in terms of solutions, I think that is a great idea. And I mentioned earlier the Freedom Cells Network. I would encourage everybody, especially if you don't have a local community and you're looking to meet people, freedomcells.org, CELLS.org. It's the idea being each of the cells or the groups, the pods, the hubs, the hives, whatever you call it, is like the cells in your body, powerful, unique individual, but also part of this larger network, this organism that is you. And so we encourage people to create groups in their local community. They can sign up on the website, create a profile, put what their goals are, their skills. You can put looking for land, have land, looking for people to grow food. And then you add yourself to the website. We don't want your home address, but the town you're in, somewhere near. And then people can search, you can search, show me all the people within my 10-mile radius, and search people who are interested in permaculture, and it'll show you the people. Go look up their profile, see what they're like. Maybe you find a local group that's already meeting in your area and get connected, get activated. Of course, the website's just the beginning. You leave the website behind, you start meeting in the real world. I've been promoting this idea since 2016. I heard about it from my buddy John Bush in 2015. Now we have 40,000 plus people around the world who've joined just through the website, and then there's groups on Telegram. I mentioned Mexico. We have 15 plus Freedom Cells around the country. People are coming together in this localized, decentralized way, talking about food, talking about these conversations we're having here, and what can we do for ourselves on the local level? How can we actually make sure that if things do get worse, as it seems they might, that we're at least a little bit in a position to help other people, to help each other, instead of playing catch up and being in a scarcity mindset. So that's what a lot of my work is about, is how do we build decentralized community? How do we take care of ourselves? I don't think everybody needs to become a farmer necessarily, but I do think we all need to think about, do you have access to food? Do you have access to water? Can you continue to live your life if they turn you off and lock you out of all these systems?
And again, it doesn't even have to be about, oh, you're afraid of this conspiracy theory. It could be a natural disaster. It could also be an attack, a foreign country attack, I suppose, like we're at war and they hit our grid or something, things that make it difficult for us to function. So being prepared goes beyond just conspiracy theories for sure. And again, growing up in Idaho and Utah, both of those states are heavily, heavily into a year's supply of food for any sort of, you just don't know why you might need that. And they don't even think to guess why. They don't, talk about big conspiracy theories or anything like that. It's just the people, it's just cultural. It's just a cultural thing to get a year's supply of food. One other thing so obviously food is a big thing, because yes, it would be great if we could all farm, but if they turned off my bank account tomorrow, it's not like I could grow something overnight in my backyard, right? It takes time to grow things. It takes the right conditions to grow things. So that's why a year's supply of food up front might be a really good idea. And then learning to farm, then you could buy yourself some time, right, to like start growing your own food.
And go connect with people who are growing food. Meet the farmers in your area. Meet the farmers markets.
But then you need money. So money is another one. So how do you survive without a bank?
Very difficult in a lot of ways. And I talk about this in the book, some of the struggles I've had being in Houston and trying to, for example, rent an apartment in the city when I don't have a banking history or a tax history or other things like that. And to top that off, I have like a nonviolent felony from 20 years ago. So people, look at me even crazier. Who's this guy? He's not in the system. It makes it difficult. And, two things on that. I think that it's important, at least for me, to kind of pick apart why that matters. And if you really think about it, we have been conditioned to believe that if somebody has a bank account, if they have a government ID, then they're a real person. They're legitimate. They're like the rest of us adults out here. We have bank accounts. And if you don't have those things, or credit cards and credit rating and all that sort of stuff, it's very difficult to get a loan or to operate in the system that they've created. And I think that's another fundamental problem that is kind of a little deeper root problem to address probably in the future. But it is difficult to operate outside their systems. I deal with a lot of cash. Being in Mexico, cash is definitely still prevalent everywhere, and it's not uncommon to use cash on everything. But even in the US, as I talk about in the book, I think there are, like I was saying with the credit union, there's kind of like half steps and half measures that you can take in that direction. PayPal used to be one of these, but we know PayPal is obviously a censorious company, but they did offer people an opportunity before. If you didn't want a physical banking institution, if you just wanted to be able to hold money and transfer around and send it around fairly quickly, That's one option. Now there's other companies like Wise and a few others, not an endorsement of any company, just companies that offer this service. So if you don't want a physical bank, but you want to hold your money and be able to move it around internationally, you can do so. Now, of course, at the end of that, there's a bank backing that, so you're still not all the way out of that system. And of course, there's things like cryptocurrency, which I have been using crypto since 2010 or 2011. I started reporting on Bitcoin in 2012. I have a lot of problems with the state of that situation and that industry at the moment. I think, like Whitney and others have pointed out, it's been completely co-opted, and it's been a battle since the beginning. But I do think cryptos like Monero, which is actually still private and the government can't crack it, at least that's what they claim publicly, and there's a ransom out for those who can help them crack the code, do offer an opportunity for those who are comfortable or interested in things like cryptocurrency. You have the ability to move money around. And of course, what do you do when it comes time to pay the rent and your landlord doesn't want Monero or they don't want Bitcoin, right? You got to turn it back into fiat. These are things that I've had to navigate. And part of being a part of the Freedom Cell network and being kind of involved in these ideas, I have developed a network of people that if I need to sell some Bitcoin or Monero to get US dollars, I can do that. I have people I can call up, and I have kind of a list of people and vice versa. And so I don't even bother really with mainstream websites. I've just developed counter economic relationships. We're creating this counter economy, parallel economy outside of the government's hands. Some of that's involving in crypto. Some of it's just cash that the government never sees or that they never get to tax and things like that. But obviously, when you're talking about bigger amounts of money, it gets more difficult. And there's no perfect answers for that now. I'm just trying to promote these ideas and get more people thinking about it, because I know, and I've met a lot of brilliant minds who I know are working on sort of the infrastructure for the future. A lot of my interactions deal with companies, for example, at our recent event, the Greater Reset, highlighting people who are doing technology, digital technology, and trying to create censorship-free messenger apps and censorship-free web hosting and sort of what people are calling Web 3 and Web 4.0. A lot of it that goes over my head because I'm not a technologist, but I know it's like, I need you to build what you're going to do, because it's going to help those of us who want to stay free and continue to talk about these things have the ability to do so. So I try to be an advocate and I guess a spokesman for those who are out there on the cutting edge, trying to promote the new systems we need to truly be free of these legacy systems that we know are going to end up being slavery systems.
I'm sure it's difficult at first, when you make a transition, but then you get used to it, right? I mean, like anything, it starts to become, it's like, okay, it seemed like a hassle at first, but you do get used to it. We do need to take a little quick break here. We are talking to Derek Broze, investigative journalist, author, and documentary filmmaker. We're going to actually talk about some of those films as well when we come back, but let's just take a quick break and we'll be back. Field of Greens is the healthiest thing that I do every day, and I want you in on this with me. It is literally a scoop a day. It tastes great. I personally really like the lemon lime flavor. It tastes like iced green tea with lemon. I know a lot of green drinks, people are a little nervous about these, but I'm telling you, Field of Greens actually tastes really great, and it's completely improved my life. The nutrition is the way nature intended. Now, when I take my daily Field of Greens, I notice that I have a lot more energy. I also notice that I crave less junk food. So for me, it is an actual noticeable change. On the days I don't drink it, I actually notice a difference, genuinely notice a difference. I have other people in my life who are taking Field of Greens. They say the same thing, like, wow, this stuff actually really does work. I actually notice a difference. So it really does work. Field of Greens is radically different. Each organic fruit and vegetable was medically chosen to support your heart and vital organ health. I trust Field of Greens to keep me healthy. I promise you're going to love this product. But if you, for any reason, don't, they're going to give you a 100% money back guarantee. And I have 15% off for you, plus off of your first order, plus free rush shipping. So visit fieldofgreens.com and use that promo code Kim. That's promo code Kim at fieldofgreens.com. Talking about ways to sort of get around the monetary system. One thing, my family's from Vietnam on my mom's side, and my grandmother's from the North, and she had to escape the French, in the war against the French, and then she left for Southern Vietnam, and then she had to flee after South Vietnam to. She left after the American War, and then actually for a while settled in Iran. And then 1978, the Iranian Revolution, and ended up having to come to America. So she kind of went all over the place with all of these various different government upheavals, wars, and whatnot. And one thing that I had been taught since I was a little girl was gold, use gold, physical, actual gold. And that's how she survived. I mean, she literally grabbed jewelry, gold, gems, diamonds, like whatever she could get, and kept those and used those every time she fled, because she didn't have, especially in those days, my grandmother's now 96 years old. So back in those days, banking. I mean, I don't think I'm not even sure what that was like in Vietnam for women back then. I don't know if that was something, but just in order to survive, in order to continue making your
Yeah,
way, that's how she did it. And so I'm a big proponent of keeping, because you just never know. I mean, you look at my grandmother who's alive
I
today,
agree.
and she's had to do this 3 times in her one lifetime,
Wow.
having to,
Yeah, I believe in gold and silver, precious metals. I mean, like you said, they hold value historically. So in a situation like your grandmother went through, if you've got nothing else, if you've got that, people
yeah.
understand, okay, this is something I can sell, I can trade later. I will trade for that. I'll take that. I hold gold, a little bit of gold. I hold silver, got some crypto. I think we should diversify as much as possible in terms of trying to use alternative currencies or currencies outside the system. And one other one people should remember: invest in gold, invest in silver if you can with whatever you've got, even if you're just putting away $5 a month or
Right.
something. But invest in yourself too. I mean, if you've got extra cash, take that course that's going to give you a little bit more knowledge about marketing so you can make yourself a little bit more money and get a little more free in the meantime. Like I think that's one thing people often overlook, is giving yourself more skills not only makes you more valuable now and potentially gives you another side hustle or way to make an income, but in the terms of some future chaotic situation, the more skills you have, especially practical skills, the more likely you are to be useful as well as able to benefit from those skills.
So the Freedom Cell Network is how people can learn, connect with other people who have similar thinking, and also how to opt out of the technocratic state. Do you give details in that book of like of some of the things that you mentioned, including how to evade taxes?
I share a little bit about my history with the IRS in here, yes, and I also do. I tried to, with the updated edition, make it as practical as possible. I thought I did that on the first edition, but some folks expressed they wanted even more of a list like thing. So I do give a look. If you want to be unbanked in the next year, start here, make some steps here, and try to make it as
Yeah.
practical as possible. So yeah, there's a bit, it's a mix of philosophy as well as practical guide how
I
to.
did have an interview a while back. I should get him back on, but Richard Werner, who is an economist, and he's really speaks out against the banking system in particular. And he's a big, big advocate of going to the community banks, of moving all your money out of the big banks
Yeah.
and going to the community bank. And that's one way to protect, because he says that they're trying to eat up all the little banks so that they could control the
Yeah.
banking system even more. But those, I think the food and the banking, to me, the banking is the biggest issue. I mean, I've dealt with deplatforming, I've dealt with censorship, all of that stuff, and that's really terrible. But that doesn't hit, that hits creators more than anybody, right? That doesn't hit the average person. But the average person, if they want to screw you over, if you're in the trucker convoy, you decide you want to protest something the government is doing, they'll debank you. How are you going to eat? How are you going to pay your rent? Right. And this is why having the food storage, having the gold on hand, physical gold on hand that you could take someplace to sell for that money to pay your mortgage or whatever. And also, yeah, moving to a smaller bank, so that doesn't happen, possibly. But those are the things and then everything else you could kind of figure out, I think, like as you go along. But those are the two things you have to have right then and there in that moment.
Absolutely, the finances and the food is such a strong part of their
Right.
control
Yeah. And
agenda.
that's and that they are using it already. And it's astonishing that they have that, the audacity to do so. I want to talk about, before we go, I want to talk about the pyramid of power. This is just an astonishing endeavor that you've done, that I'm really honestly in awe of this, and I think it's so amazing. But this is a 17-part documentary series focusing on answering the question, who rules the world? Right? You've got this in different seasons. Let me just click on season 1 so that I can, because I'm really excited to actually start watching these. Season 1, big education, establishment media, big tech, the Hollywood military industrial complex. So tell us what these are. And then you have multiple seasons with other topics. Tell us what these are.
Sure. So the pyramid of power, you can find it at thepyramidofpower.net. I first started sharing this idea, which was sort of just, I guess, a collection of all my research over the years as a in-person presentation that ended up being 2.5 hours long. And I thought, you know what, there's probably a better format for all this information. And I thought a documentary series would really do it, because my goal with this series is to try to take the best bits of information. So, for example, you'll see some of my original interviews with G. Edward Griffin or James Corbett and others, but you'll also see clips from other documentaries that have already covered some of these topics, and I just take to sort of highlight. And so that was what my inspiration was. How can I take the best books and documentaries that are already out there, plus my own original research, condense that down into 30 minutes or less, like something that people could sit down in bite-sized chunks, give them just the facts, no speculation, no fear porn, doomsday, all that kind of stuff, and give them suggested reading, further watching, and solutions for every episode. And so that was kind of the idea. And the goal, and I think we've succeeded so far, is for it to really be bingeable for this Netflix generation. That if you sit somebody down, you have a friend, or if you're totally new to this information, we start pretty basic: education system, establishment media, big tech. These are all things that more and more people have become familiar with it. And the idea is that each episode, as we make our way up the pyramid, gets progressively a little more, quote unquote, conspiratorial, a little deeper, and still backed up with evidence and with data, because it's all there. The truth is really scarier than people realize. And yeah, trying to do that so that if somebody could start totally new to this stuff, and by the end of the series, maybe be completely aware to this stuff. And not only that, have some potential solutions. Like in the banking chapter, for example, I discussed some of the things we discussed today as potential options for people. And so we've released 13 of them so far. The idea was originally we were doing like 4 episodes per quarter, like as seasons. Last year, things slowed down a little bit just because I was super busy. But we've released the first episode of season 4, which I think is the best one so far. It's called The Technocratic State, which covers much of what we discussed today. I think it really just encapsulates everything, the quality. I do all the research, I do the narration, and I write the script. And I'm blessed to work with some amazing editors recently, and they've just made the work shine. And so we're now on the final season. The goal is by the end of this year, 2024, we're going to release chapter 14 within a month from now, and then 15 and 16. And then the final episode is sort of like an addendum that's going to actually answer, well, who is at the top? Now we've shown you all these pieces, and I'm going to interview everybody that's in there, a lot of the different guests and kind of researchers and journalists, and let them answer in their own words of who or what do you think is at the top of the pyramid. And I'll offer some of my own insight, of course, and still trying to stick, as close as we can to the facts when we get into some of that more speculative areas. But so far, people have responded really well. As I mentioned to you earlier, there's been some people who've told me they've used it for homeschooling curriculum, or just that they've had luck getting friends and family who wouldn't watch previous videos or longer documentaries, getting them to sit down and just watch a 25-minute episode of this, and then getting them intrigued and willing to go further. So that seems like it's accomplishing what I set out to do.
This is just really cool. Season 2, big wireless, the oligarchy, big pharma and the medical cartel, food as a weapon. So these are really, really interesting topics. I'm just going to go through these seasons because I'm interested in this. Season 3, the prison industrial complex, the foundations and the nonprofit industrial complex. Oh, interesting. What is that about?
So let me see if I have the book here. I'm going to reach real quick. This book was published in the 50s. It's called The Foundations. It was written by Rene Wormser, who was actually he was an investigator. And long story short, there was this thing called the Reese Committee in the 50s, where they actually set out to investigate what these nonprofit foundations, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller, Carnegie, et cetera, what influence they had on the U.S. government. And this report is, just this knowledge is I think totally unknown to our generation, but it was all right there in writing and in congressional reports showing that they were enacting their influence through the education system, through grants and philanthropy, et cetera. And so that chapter kind of talks about that. And then it also discusses more this idea of the nonprofit industrial complex, which is like NGOs and nonprofits and think tanks, which often suck up a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned activists and bring them kind of back into that framework where they're just doing certain work that, in my view, isn't actually achieving the goals they want. And there's a really good book about that discusses the nonprofit industrial complex and how many people who've worked in that realm felt like they weren't actually serving the goals that they set out to do. And in the end, they realized that these foundations I'm talking about are actually kind of at the top of most of these different think tanks and nonprofits and NGOs. And not to mention, I think I cover in that chapter too, how NGOs have been used by the CIA as well for all kinds of different things. So it looks at that whole
I think people are becoming more and more
topic.
aware of that. I mean, during COVID, we saw like the Gates Foundation, right? Seemed to be, and then people opened their eyes and realized that this one foundation was donating money all over the medical community, which caused everybody to have the same line of thinking because that's where their money was coming from. Things like that. And also
Exactly.
now, I think people are starting to wonder because they're hearing a lot about the border and all these NGOs that seem to be set up that are helping, that are kind of fueling a lot of the, rather than it being a natural migration process, there does seem to be sort of an industry behind it, which is, yeah. So that's, I think more people are opening their eyes to that particular aspect. So you also have the banking cartel and the future of money, the crimes of the intelligence community. I don't know.
That's our
I was going
biggest
to say, how did
episode
you keep
yet.
that? How long is that one?
That one's about an
Yeah.
hour. That one we didn't keep to our time limit on that one because I had the even extra ambitious goal of looking at the US, UK, Chinese, and Russian
Yeah, okay.
intelligence. So that episode covers, because in my view, those obviously superpowers, these are the big players, and you go back to World War II and British MI6. There's so much there, and including, and now if obviously the Israeli situation is in a lot of people's minds, you need to really truly understand the extent of how big Israel's intelligence capabilities are, and I mean they have just such an immense apparatus, and so that section on Israel is probably the longest part of the entire chapter.
And then season 4 so far, you have the technocratic state, which is a lot of what we talked about today, out, and you have more coming. When are the other ones coming out, did you say?
Chapter 14, which is called The False Flag Deception, will be coming out hopefully by the end of March. And then, so The False Flag Deception is the next one. We're going to be looking at, of course, I'll mention 9/11, but it's not going to be focused on 9/11 and just how people have questions about that. It's more focused on the Syria gas attack claims from 2013 and 2016, 2018, which I think Aaron and Max over at Gray Zone have done a great job following and debunking over the years, in addition to the Oklahoma City bombing, which is another situation that a lot of people don't know about, but has clear-cut evidence of the story we were told not being true. And then chapter 15 is going to be called, I think it's called the pedo class, and it's about the pedophilia issue and how that seems to infect politics, religion, government, media, academia, all over the world. And I've done a lot of work. I started investigating Epstein back in 2017, and I've got a documentary about the Finders cult as well. So we're going to talk about some of those situations, how that pervades a lot of our world, because I do think that goes to the highest levels. And then chapter 16 is going to be about religion and secret societies. So it's going to get deeper.
I don't know how you'll stop at 17. It seems like you're going to have to just keep going. There's so much.
I've thought about that. I'm like, I could add a whole nother one on, like, get more kind of specialized, like geoengineering specifically, or like fluoride. Like fluoride's mentioned in the chapter on health and food and the medical cartel, but kind of just as an example, I could do one whole episode on just the fluoride lawsuit.
Wow.
There's so much.
Very interesting. Well, the pyramidofpower.net, I do have that link down below so that people could start watching those various different 30-minute typically, except for the intelligence, the crimes of the intelligence community. But that one I'm sure is extra interesting and frightening at the same time. Derek, you are just a wealth of knowledge. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how any of you guys over at TLAB do it, to be honest with you. Ryan is a wealth of Whitney. I mean, all of you are just like blow my mind, honestly, with how much research you guys do and how much information you have absorbed in those brains of yours. Just like off the top of your head.
Well, thank you.
It's like amazing. It really is. So really appreciate your time today. Derek Brose, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for your time.